Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Backlund. I'm from Colorado State University, and I'm here with a panel of colleagues to talk about climate indicators for agriculture. This is a new technical report produced over the last several years by USDA and a team of academic authors. It was sponsored by USDA's Office of Energy and Environmental Policy with the goal of providing usable, accurate information to agricultural stakeholders and producers to help them manage and respond to the challenges posed by climate change. The report is really grounded in the last 50 years of observational data about changes that have affected agriculture and the way that agriculture has responded. It lays out a set of about 20 indicators across a variety of categories and provides information about their significance and potential utility for stakeholders. We're going to talk through some of the results here in this short panel session, and then we look forward to discussing this more broadly with a larger audience in the live session of NCSE in early January. With that, I'm going to turn, well, let me start by introducing my fellow panelists that are with me here today. I have Rachel Melnick from the Agricultural and Food Systems Institute in Washington, D.C. We have Margaret Walsh, Dr. Margaret Walsh from the USDA Energy and Environmental Policy Office, Dr. Lawrence Buja from the University of Nevada, Reno, and as I said, I'm Peter Backlund from Colorado State University. We are all co-authors on the report. There is a larger set of authors, and we'll list them at the end of this discussion. With that introductory bit, I'd like to now turn to the substance of the report. And the first issue that we wanted to address was what an indicator actually is. And I'd like to ask Meg Walsh if she would be willing to give us a little background on indicators and what they are.
Terrific, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'm Margaret Walsh. I'm the senior ecologist in USDA's Office of Energy and Environmental Policy. The office was interested in this report in order to enable operational decision-making within agriculture and other types of land management, and also to show the larger context, the changing context in which agriculture is operating in the US. And so all of this does beg the question, what is an indicator? So in short, an indicator is a measurement, a calculation, or a statistic that helps us understand conditions and trends. It connects user needs to the available data and information in a way that's consistent with the underlying system and framework. So we're informing real mechanical decisions and the way the system scientifically operates. The data are reliable and robust, and we're going to hear a little bit more about the time frame and how these indicators were selected for this report here in a moment. The indicators, they can be used in decision making, and that's certainly the purpose here. They can be observed directly, or an indicator can be calculated based on an observation, and we have some examples of that. Or an indicator can be modeled, and we have some examples of that as well. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about indicators. And I think we're going to hear about how our indicators were selected next. Peter, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I was wondering, Rachel, if you might be willing to say a few words about that. We just heard from Meg about what they are and just that definition. Data sets or observations or model results or calculations that tell us about the status of things in agriculture. That's an awfully broad remit. So could you say a little bit about how we actually went through a process to select a set of meaningful indicators for this activity?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. So as already stated, the potential for indicators for climate change is very broad, and the author team wanted to have a selection criteria for inclusion in this report. So the first selection criteria for an indicator would be that the indicator must have a clear relationship to climate change, climate trends. Then, since it is indicators for agriculture, the indicator must be relevant and important to agricultural production, food systems, and/or food security. And then we wanted indicators that had a historical context. So indicators that were based on observations and data that provide sufficient historical context to understand changes over time and what they mean to agriculture. We really strove to have inclusion of data that supports the indicator that would be available to the scientific community, well documented, and whether it was appropriately reproducible. And lastly, the overall set of indicators should provide a broad view of the interactions of climate change and agriculture and address multiple aspects of agricultural production. And based off of that, we will now go into the different aspects of agricultural production, I believe, right, Peter?
I think so. So as Meg and Rachel just explained, we went through a process to identify a wide range of indicators. We came up with 20 across a number of different categories. And the first category that we want to address are physical indicators and why they matter. And I'd like to turn to Lawrence Buja to address that issue.
Okay, great. So the physical indicators are the variables such as temperature and precipitation that have direct effects on agricultural production and food systems. So with the physical indicators, we established the national, regional, and local baselines within a global context for the evolving climate forcings that U.S. agriculture is experiencing. The physical indicators also tend to be those where the available observations are the strongest. And some of the trends we saw out of this was that changes in the size and intensity of extreme precipitation events, both floods and droughts, have increased across much of the US. This results in soil and nutrient loss, disease occurrence, impairment of root growth and function, and overall field wetness resulting in reductions in field work days. With soil moisture, this is the one variable that we felt we had the least data for, but it integrates many climate influences on crop production, such as precipitation, evapotranspiration, solar radiation, temperature, vapor pressure, and wind. High nighttime air temperatures adversely affect livestock health and have implications for grain and vegetable production, particularly during pollination. Heat waves, another one of our variables, interfere with the normal biophysical functioning of agricultural plants and animals. And then finally, humidity has increased at most of the regional scales for the US over the last 50 years. And this is a key factor in plant and animal stress indices and provides a measure of the atmospheric water available for agriculture. Thank you, Peter.
So what you just described then is a whole set of forcings that are essentially pressing on the agricultural production system and are having direct effects on it. These same forcings also affect other aspects of the environment that in turn affect agriculture. So these are the so-called indirect effects. And we have a whole set of indicators around those in kind of the categories of biological and phenological phenomena. And Rachel, I'm wondering if you could address those, the things that are being changed by climate that are then affecting agriculture.
Absolutely. So for the biological indicators, we're looking at how climate variables impact biotic stresses that could affect and then indirectly impact crop production and animal agriculture. So within that, there was a big focus on pests, pathogens, and weeds, and the different biotic stressors for crop production. Not just crop production, but also range management. So one indicator is weed range and infestation intensity, and how climate is impacting what weeds are, where they are located, and the populations of those weed pests, not just for agricultural land, but also for invasive species that could impact other areas, such as kudzu, which is very endemic to the southeastern United States. Another indicator is insect infestation in crops, and looking at how shifts in temperature and precipitation patterns are changing the incidence and range of insect pests that impact agricultural production. Going along with that, as those who have a background in integrated pest management are, we had to go to the pathogens as well after looking at weeds and insects. So crop pathogens is another indicator, and in looking at how changing climate conditions alter aspects of pathogen biology and how that impacts disease development. Also looking at the spatial distribution and how that impacts the interaction, and looking at actually distribution of pathogens where they're occurring. So we might find pathogens in new areas where they haven't occurred in the past. Lastly, the last indicator is for biologicals, pesticide use. And as the pest pathogens are, the pest and pathogen populations are shifting, this is also changing pesticide use in the different regions for crop production. So to go along with the biotic indicators or biological indicators, look at the phenological indicators. So the timing of seasonal activities are impacted by climate conditions. So the phenological indicators are looking at climate conditions over time and look at, it's kind of a bridge between the physical indicators and the biological events. So one of the indicators is timing of bud break. This is very important for fruit production and fruit trees and how that is influenced by temperature, soil moisture, radiation, and humidity. Another is pollinators and pollinator management. So being able to determine whether the native pollinators are going to be present when they are needed. Are they present when the flowering occurs, or maybe as the climate is changing, there might actually be a mistiming of those two events. Winter chilling units, looking at how crops could be impacted by chilling during the winter, and that's an impact blooming in the spring. And insect generations per season. So temperature is very highly correlated with insect emergence, reproduction, phenology, development, survival, and range. And lastly, that would be disease vectors in livestock, in particular looking at potentially ticks and other insects that actually vector diseases in livestock, and how climate change could be changing the prevalence and biodiversity of disease vectors in livestock.
So we've just heard about a whole set of physical, biological, and phenological indicators that are changing the context in which agriculture occurs and are changing they're both directly affecting agriculture and affecting the environmental conditions that surround agriculture. These are very important phenomena, but the other side of this really is how then is the agricultural system itself responding to these pressures? And we identified a set of crop and livestock indicators that help provide this picture. And Meg, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those.
You bet, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so these crop and livestock indicators are sort of where the rubber meets the road. How is climate changing the conditions within the production systems themselves? Now, the United States is a big country. There are a huge range of crop types and animal agriculture production types and locations, so there are a lot of possible indicators here. In the end, our author team settled on 3, which have a wide applicability across the country. They can be applied to commodity crops, to specialty crops, and to various kinds of animal agriculture as well. So the 3 kinds are, the 3 indicators that the author team selected are animal heat stress, crop growing region migration, and leaf wetness duration. So first off, animal heat stress. This is calculated based on heat and humidity, which are widely measured observations, and it's a fairly straightforward calculation. Animals are affected by a high heat and humidity index, high heat stress, a lot like people are. When you get too hot, you eat less, you move less, and in terms of animal agriculture, this influences your milk, meat, and egg productivity. It influences your reproduction success. In very extreme cases, it can even lead to increased mortality. So that's the animal heat stress indicator. The migration of crop growing regions is the second indicator we have in this section. And just for example, 25 years ago, there was very little corn grown in North Dakota, for example. Now there are several million acres of corn being harvested consistently every year in North Dakota. And so that's an example of the migration of these crop growing regions. And then leaf wetness duration. If things are wetter, if things are more humid, that creates a certain microclimate on crop leaves that can encourage pathogen success. And that can affect yields, and that can affect the marketability of different sorts of agricultural products as well. So that's leaf wetness. Obviously, it's something that can vary a great deal. It's going to be trending upward in places that are getting more humid, downward in other places. So these results are very localized. Your results may vary, but these are very powerful, very useful indicators for us to have within the agricultural production systems themselves.
Thanks for that, Meg. I think we're seeing an interesting theme here of connection across these indicators, which makes sense in this framing of forcing and response. We also looked at a set of indicators of impact, which can be thought of as essentially, after all these changes occur, what's the effect of them on the agricultural system, the remaining effect? And this was a challenging area to look at. I think there's a lot of potential here for a lot of interesting information, but there's also a lot of potential for confusion because of the difficulty of isolating the climate signal and some very complex interactions. But we did identify 3 socioeconomic indicators that we think help provide a really good picture of the impact of the kind of changes that we just heard about. And the first one is heat-related mortality. This is actually rather closely related to what Meg just spoke about with livestock heat stress. Humans are also stressed by high temperature, and in really bad conditions, human survival can be threatened by high temperatures. And we thought that looking at the mortality, the heat-related mortality rate of agricultural workers would be an interesting way of capturing human impact of climate change in the agricultural system. And it turns out that these statistics are tracked over time and can be looked at. And there's a very interesting record that we show in the report that shows a rather steady increase in heat-related mortality. Interestingly, there also are a lot of adaptive measures that can be taken to address this issue, but looking at that mortality rate will show us a lot about how successful we are or are not at adapting to the changing physical conditions of agriculture. Another socioeconomic indicator we looked at is more in the economic realm, and we took a hard look at the data around payouts for crop insurance associated with extreme events and disasters. And so there's a very extensive system of crop insurance in the United States, and it's a very important tool for farmers to mitigate risk. And looking at the statistics of what got paid out for what kind of disaster can show us where the financial risks to farmers were and what happened to them. And there's a very interesting tool that's been developed by the USDA Agricultural Research Service that enables these data to be tracked. And it's a very interesting picture that emerges. And I strongly recommend people look at this if they're interested in trying to assess the economic risks to production from extreme events. Finally, we have an indicator in this area that is that's really a large kind of composite indicator, and we're proposing that looking at total factor productivity, which essentially is the ratio between agricultural inputs and agricultural outputs over time. And there is some emerging evidence that climate is a factor perhaps in dampening the rate of growth of productivity in agriculture. And we think that that is worth looking at very closely as things move ahead, because that is an indicator. It's one of the indicators that Meg talked about that that aggregate a lot of other information, a kind of composite indicator, and we feel that it could be very useful in examining climate change effects going forward. With that brief overview of what we did, I'd like to turn finally to Meg to say a few words about where we're going with this in the future.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, there's so many possible directions, right? I think something that we're planning to do, we're starting to work on, is because these conditions, these indicators vary widely, and because agricultural production is every production situation is very unique, it's very specific. We're working on making these indicators geographically explicit and regularly updated, so folks can go in and reference their specific location for the indicators that really matter to them, so they can, to inform their immediate decision-making needs and also future planning needs going forward. So that's what we're doing with that.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to talking about this with a live audience, as I said, at the NCSE live sessions later in the year. We'd like to close now with sharing a little information. We'll show you the report cover and provide the URL for the report and a complete listing of authors, and thank all of you who are listening for engaging with this issue and being concerned about climate and agriculture. And with that, I'm going to show our report and authors. It's rather a long URL, but you can find this report easily by searching for climate indicators for agriculture. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you, and we're going to call our session to a close.